Hello, New Covenant Parish. Good to be with you to talk about our lectionary gospel reading for the week. It's taken from Matthew chapter 25, 1 through 13. And this is, as many of you know, the familiar parable of the 10 bridesmaids. And the subject of the story is the second coming of Christ. Now, when you read this parable, notice that the teaching of the wise and foolish maids builds on the teaching just before of the wise and foolish servants. Both parables teach the need to live in a manner that expects the return of the Lord, even when the return is delayed. The parable opens with a familiar phrase: the kingdom of heaven will be like this. So the kingdom is like the whole scene portrayed by this parable, where some bridesmaids are prepared for the groom and enjoy the banquet, while others are excluded because of their lack of preparation. Now, the banquet itself is symbolic of the end-time messianic banquet that's mentioned a lot in the scriptures, a meal in the age to come, often pictured as a marriage supper with Jesus as the groom and the church as both bride and invited guests. But the importance of a typical wedding banquet would not have been lost on the first century readers of this story. Wedding banquets usually lasted about 7 days, and the processions of the bride and groom marked the beginning of just an absolutely joyous event. In this story, it's expected that the bridesmaids would wait for the bridegroom and greet him with a procession of light in the darkness. And probably the bridesmaids are waiting either at the bride's home for the groom to come get her, or at the home of the groom's family where the wedding would take place. All the maids have lamps, and they're lit, and they're ready to welcome the groom at any time. But in this story, the bridegroom is delayed. And this really was not that uncommon. Sometimes, for instance, there could be last-minute negotiations, a lot of negotiations in weddings back then, between the groom and the bride's relatives about gifts to be exchanged. Now, the story doesn't explain the delay, but the reason for the delay is no concern of the bridesmaids. They should have been ready for a delay in case it happened. The delay also echoes what happens in the parable before this one about the 2 servants. And it's also a part of the story in the parable that comes after this, the parable of the talents. And all 3 of them illustrate Jesus' warning in 24:14. Therefore you must be ready, for the Son of Man comes at an unexpected hour. Now, because the groom is late and the hour is late, all the bridesmaids have fallen asleep. But their sleepiness is not the problem, because both wise and foolish ones become drowsy. The wise ones, though, brought extra oil for their lamps. So both groups knew that the groom was coming and waited with their lamps burning, but only half of them considered that the wait in the darkness could have been a lot longer than planned. And finally, around midnight, someone shouts that the groom is coming. They can see him yonder down the road. So all the maids get up and start trimming their lamps, getting them lit up for the procession. And that's when the foolish ones discover they're not going to have enough oil to keep their lamps burning. Now, the wise maids refuse to lend them extra oil. If they do, they won't have enough themselves, and the procession will just be totally ruined. So the wise maids tell the foolish, you all better go get some more oil before it's too late and he arrives. So they hurry off, and somehow, in the middle of the night, were able to buy more oil. But while they were away, making arrangements that should have already been made, the groom arrives, the procession occurs without the foolish maids, and the banquet begins. The foolish maids return, see that they've missed the procession, go to the banquet house, knock on the door, but are turned away. So they end up missing everything. So, what's the parable teaching us? Basically, the bridesmaids were chosen to accompany the bride and groom, but their role as bridesmaids didn't guarantee them a place at the banquet. They had initially played the part of wedding attendants. They waited with lamps lit for a while, but they hadn't planned for a long, dark time of waiting. And as a result, they were shut out of the banquet. The Maids Plea in verse 11, Lord, Lord, open to us. Their words remind us of Jesus' warning back in chapter 7 of the Gospel, Sermon on the Mount, that not everyone who cries, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. And the parable itself is summed up in verse 13. Keep awake, therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour. Keep awake can also be translated be vigilant, which is probably a better way to understand it. In the parable, the bridegroom's arrival is certain. He's going to get there eventually, but when is the question, which shows the need for constant vigilance. Now, we can be sure that the earliest readers of this gospel have already entered the dark days after the crucifixion and the resurrection and have begun waiting for Christ's return. And this parable is challenging them to be vigilant and live in anticipation of Christ's coming. But, for us today, when we read this story, we may find ourselves at least a little bit sympathetic to the foolish maids. I mean, do we really live as though the bridegroom's arrival is certain, coming any day now? Some parts of the church have been caught up in trying to determine the day and the hour. That's what they do. While other parts have just let the lamp run out, and we don't worry a lot about it at all. But in contrast to those ways of thinking and living, the parable teaches us to live in vigilance, which means that disciples should be doing the tasks that they've been appointed to do in preparation for the Master's coming, doing them all the time. And in Matthew's gospel, we've been studying this year, these tasks include bearing witness to God's kingdom by welcoming the stranger, feeding the hungry, visiting the sick, the imprisoned, making disciples in all the world, loving God and neighbor, loving even enemies, working for peace, seeking the righteousness of the kingdom of God every day. We're looking forward to that kingdom coming. In other words, we're to always be attending to the tasks that anticipate the arrival of the bridegroom and the beginning of the banquet. And as Presbyterians, I promise you this, our preparations are not done to earn us an admission ticket. It's more like we're training for attendance, to be able to fully appreciate the kingdom life we'll someday experience through God's love for us in Jesus Christ. So let's stay awake, be vigilant, and always be ready to welcome the bridegroom. It's good to be with you this week, my friends, and I hope either in union or on Facebook we'll be together this Sunday. God bless you.